Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 328, featuring Dmitry Vinnik, technical director and supervisor, also known as Silhouette Images. And believe it or not, I have known Dmitry from the early days of V-Ray, back before it was even a product. I think he and I might be the original fanboys of V-Ray. Like, I'm going to go as far back as that. And we actually knew each other and quite a bit, back in the early 2000s in terms of what was going on there. So it was kind of fun to check it out and talk to him about all the cool stuff going on. Kristen, besides the fact that you hear the two oldest fanboys of V-Ray talking about the cool old days of the early 2000s, what did you think of this podcast?
It was great. You guys discussed V-Ray a lot, and I love that. And we just get to kind of hear his story from how an early age, it was in Russia and then to Canada, kind of was interested in gaming and graphics, and then progressed his film school. And he's worked on Battlestar Galactica, the TV show Tron Legacy, to Game of Thrones.
Right.
And also how he's kind of brought V-Ray to each studio he's worked at, and they've had great results. So that was awesome. And then at the end, you guys talk about kind of the work from home situation and how they're dealing with that, and future technology. So it was just a great podcast.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun hanging out with Dmitry. I mean, like I said, we used to hang out. Well, we used to chat quite a bit on the V-Ray forums long before that. And it was kind of funny running into at SIGGRAPH, many years later. And he goes, "Hey, it's Dmitry." And I was like, I didn't know who he was because he goes by Silhouette Images on his thing. And so, I finally oh, that's who you are. And then, Dmitry and I go way back. And so he's been a great contributor, not just, obviously to Chaos as well, because he's been giving us a huge amount of feedback, and a lot of the features and stuff comes from those guys who really sort of know how to use the software. So thank you so much for being such a great friend to us, Dmitry, but obviously, being able to hang out with us and finally be able to share your story on the podcast. So it's a lot of fun. Okay, let's talk about some events going on at Chaos. Kristen, what is going on?
All right. So you can find these out at chaos.com/events. The first one will be June 8th. We talked about this last week. It is Exploring V-Ray 5 for 3ds Max with Jonas Noel. You get to discover new features of V-Ray for 3ds Max, plus workflow tips from an expert user. And
Perfect.
then on June 9th, this will be an online one as well. It's a new product announcement webinar for SketchUp Studio and V-Ray 5 for SketchUp, and it will be held in Japanese. So you can sign up online for those.
Perfect. That sounds great. We don't have any quick announcements right now on chaos.com, but those will be coming soon. So keep an eye on all that news by going to chaos.com. If people want to know more about the podcast, Kristen, where can they go?
You can go to facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast or chaos.com/CG Garage. And if you want to watch us on YouTube, you can go to youtube.com/Chaos Group TV.
Perfect. And if you guys have any ideas or things you want to do, or any ideas for the podcast at all, just email us, labs@chaosgroup.com. We'd love to hear your ideas. If you want to have different guests or new guests, or you have some feedback on any particular episode, we'd love to hear about it. And of course, don't forget to leave us a review on Apple Podcast, and that's always welcome, and share us with your friends. Okay, that being said, please enjoy this awesome podcast with my good friend and good friend of the company, Dmitry Vinnik.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
Well, I was trying to think, Dmitry, how long we've known each other, and it has to be since at least, in terms of us communicating with each other, at least 2001, right?
Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah.
2001 or 2, something like that.
Yeah, and I think we should explain to people where we first met, which was on the Chaos Group forum, which was the V-Ray forum at the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the first time I saw you in person was at a SIGGRAPH, and you came up to me and say, "Hi, Dmitry." It's like, "Okay, Dmitry." And it's like, "You know me as Silhouette Imaging." I was like, "Oh, of course."
Yeah.
I remember that. It was really cool. So this is it's really interesting. So it's like you said, we run into each other at SIGGRAPH all the time, and we've been knowing each other for a long time, and we've actually been very, very much part of the early days of V-Ray, and we worked with Vlado quite a bit. But let's go back a little bit. I want to know a little bit of your back history. How did you get into computer graphics? What got your passion into all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I used to I grew up in former Soviet Union.
Uh-huh.
So, computers were like a rare thing.
Okay.
And then my parents ended up going to the United States of America in 89.
In 89, wow.
In 89, yeah. And they brought back a PC, which was a 286. It's the number of the CPU it had.
Yeah.
And it had like 8-bit graphics and just and I loved it. Like I couldn't get enough of it. So since then I was kind of like really involved into like games, and just like I really liked the cinematic looks of the games. Not like, I mean, I enjoyed playing games, but the cinematic part is what really like got me sort of excited. Like
the stories.
The stories, but also like how cool it looked.
Right.
I just loved, like, because the games back in the 90s, they were like pretty primitive in terms of like graphics.
Like what kind of games are you talking like Space Quest and those types of games? Police Quest?
So the very first one I played was like Wolfenstein.
Oh yeah, that was a 3D game.
Yeah, right? But I mean, like, it was pretty, I mean, it was awesome in the day. Like, it was great, right?
Yeah.
But I think like StarCraft is what I remember playing, and this was the game that kind of has turned the tide for me to start thinking like, how can I do something like that? Like, this is super cool. And Blizzard was just pretty much innovating in terms of like all these cinematics that they were putting out with Warcraft, with StarCraft, with Diablo and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I must have been like 15 or 16 years old. So old enough to understand that they must be using some kind of software, right? And it wasn't Photoshop.
Right.
And so I got a 3ds Max 2, I think.
Was it Max or was it before? Was it still in DOS?
It was called 3D Studio 2.
Oh, so it's the one in DOS, not Max, right? So yeah.
Yeah, like pretty old, right?
Uh-huh.
And I opened it and I was like, all right, here I go. And then that was it, right? Because there was no Google, there was no internet. Like, you couldn't just go in and YouTube and watch how do you make stuff, right?
Right.
So I basically I figured out how to take like screenshots of the cinematics, like when they were playing back. So I took like screenshots of whatever I liked, and then I tried to like load that up in Max and make something similar. And that's how the process started. So I was basically just clicking every button I could to figure out like, how do you move a vertex? How do you move a face?
Wow.
How do you put a texture? Couldn't figure out how to put a texture on. So I like traced and modeled like parts that were textural and stuff back. Yeah. So that's how it got started.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I remember when I was in architecture school, and I was helping this another student, and she was trying to do in architecture. She was trying to do chain link fence, right? And the way that you would do it back then, would do a plane and you put a texture of a chain link fence with opacity on it, because that was the best way. She literally modeled all the chain link. And I said, "Oh my God." She goes, "It took me forever." I was like, "Yeah, I bet."
What software was that in?
That was an AutoCAD.
Oh, okay.
Can you imagine how painful that was? So when you're saying you're trying to model textures, like it's like, yeah, that's painful.
Yeah, there was this like spacecraft. They called them, I think, Wrath or something. It was like this was like a fighter, and it had like a skull with bones on the side of it. And I was like, I want that. So I just like I drew it with splines and extruded it out. And
nice. It probably looked really great, and you probably learned a whole lot from it, huh?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And after that, my parents were like, because I was basically just like finishing high school, and they were like,
and you were still in the Soviet Union at this. No, I guess
no, I was
Russia.
already in Canada.
Are you in Canada? When did you move to Canada?
This was like 1997.
Okay, yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so I was pretty much finishing high school, and they were like, where are you going to go? And I said, I like doing this stuff. So they took me to Art Institute of Seattle. And they're like, hey, you want to go and study there? But then because it was in the States, right? And so for me, that would mean like completely moving to Seattle for a while. And then somebody recommended Vancouver Film School. And it was local, it was close, like I could commute there, and obviously financially it was made more sense. Right. So I just went there instead.
Right. That's a good school. It's a really good school.
Yeah. It
Excellent.
Was famous, world famous.
Yeah, it's a very good school. Now, did they have much 3D and computer graphics back then? Yeah,
they did. I mean, it's probably not like right now. I think right now all of it would be like focused on whether it's it's probably they probably have like categories now of like, are you a modeler, a sculptor, an animator, so on, right? A compositor. Right. But back then it was like pretty primitive. It was like, hey, here's a couple of months course. Couple of months course crash course on Maya, and off you go.
Right. Is that the first place you picked up Maya? As I guess at school. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I came in there like a hardcore Max guy, right? And they were like, no, Max, no, we use Maya here. Right. I was like, okay. So then I learned a bit of Maya, and then I was like, well, both software are powerful. Right. So I'm going to be using both. And that's been the case for the last 20 years.
Yeah. I remember very specifically, we'll get into the V-Ray thing, but I remember very specifically now let's continue with the story. Actually, I'll get to that point. So this was around 97. You go to school, you started studying Maya, and you're doing that stuff. So what happened when you got out of school? Did you get a job at some place or start freelancing?
Yeah. So what I did is I actually took a 2-course. They had like these package course deals. Okay. And it was live drawing / hand-drawn animation.
Oh, nice.
And that went on for a year. And then for another 6 months, it was the 3D. And so for the first year, I learned live drawing. I learned hand-drawn animation, like basically cell. It was pretty difficult. It was pretty hard. There were like people in the class who were much better than me, like who were much more artistic. I never really liked like drawing animation. I always liked like detailed stuff. So I would like draw one picture of like, let's say a cyborg, but that was like super detailed. And all of the guys in my class, they were more like traditional animators who could like draw loose concepts really fast, and they had like really good understanding of that stuff. Right. And so for me, like I kind of struggle with that a little bit. And when I went to 3D, because I already knew a bit of 3D before, like just on my own, it was much easier for me to kind of like understand that. So when I left school, I was like, all right, I'm prepared. I got all this experience, doing whatever in 3D and drawing. And this was late 90s. And I think there was some kind of like crisis happening. And basically there was no work. There was no work, and so many people looking for work in the art field, in games, in visual effects that nobody wanted a student, someone fresh out of school,
Right.
Who doesn't have any experience. Everybody was like, where is your demo reel? Where is your like professional experience? And I was like, I'm a student. I don't have any. And so it took me about a year of like really messing about to find a job. And during that year, I was just like learning more on a computer all the time, just experimenting with more rendering, more. This is sort of like what I understood that I like best, is to like texture render stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a job with like an architectural firm.
Okay.
And they did like just architectural renderings. Yep. So for me, it was like, doesn't matter. Like I'll do that. It wasn't what I wanted to do. Like I wanted to work in the film industry.
Mm-hmm.
But there was the job that was available. It was a close proximity to what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And that was at the time when V-Ray first came out.
Right. Yes.
I think before we were using like scanline, basically.
Yeah. or ray tracing on top of it or something of that nature. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So like, I think the very first project of mine, I mapped stuff on cards with opacity.
Oh,
because
right.
it just couldn't, the computers couldn't handle it. And
Right.
so then V-Ray came out and I came to my boss and I was like, hey, check this out. This looks really great.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, yeah, let's get it. So so then started like rendering V-Ray a lot. And then I left that company after about a year.
Yep.
And I went to work for another smaller studio, which is called Bardell Entertainment.
Okay.
And what they did was they did like 3D cartoons.
Okay.
So it was like cartoon animation, but it was all animated in Maya and then like do like basic toon shading and rendered it in Maya Scanline. So I worked there for a bit on that. And then I found a job at this place called Enigma Studios, and they had Battlestar Season 1.
Battlestar Galactica. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was like, yeah, that, to me, it didn't really matter, but I was getting like closer into like TV and film land, and this was my kind of goal. And so I came there, and they asked me to basically take the models, which were done in Lightwave, like everything was done from Pilot. Zoic did the whole thing.
Yeah.
And convert it to their Max in Brazil pipeline.
Okay.
Because Brazil at the time was like considered like the top stuff, the quality and stuff.
Yeah.
So after rendering for a bit in Brazil, I came to my then supervisor and I was like, hey, there's this other renderer of V-Ray. It's much faster. It's going to be so much better. You have to understand that like Lightwave, it had some kind of feature with like ginormous geometry handling where you could have like hundreds of millions of polygons. It didn't care. It could render it.
Yeah, because it instanced things really intelligently at that time. Yeah.
Something like that. And back then, computers had like very little RAM.
2 gigs maximum.
Like, yeah, exactly, right? And like Windows XP or like whatever Windows there was, like couldn't even use all of it.
Right.
So we had a hard time rendering this stuff in Brazil, basically. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, okay, let's try V-Ray. So we got like one copy of V-Ray. And right away, like we could render stuff with V-Ray where we couldn't with Brazil.
Interesting.
So then they were like, okay, let's go with V-Ray. And we started doing stuff in Max and V-Ray, and our stuff started looking so much better than the Lightwave stuff. That created a problem where the show supervisor came and was like, your stuff looks great, but it doesn't match what other vendors are doing.
Right.
So then we ran into a bit of an issue with that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that can happen. I can imagine.
Yeah.
But that was a great show. That was a great show, and the effects on it were really cool. And I think those were that's kind of an awesome show to be involved in, I'm sure.
Yeah, as a first like film TV production for myself, definitely. And I mean, there was definitely drawbacks to using Max back in the day, and V-Ray 2, to be honest, because like there was no layering, no frame buffer, AOVs. There was none of that. And Lightwave had a lot of that already built in.
Yep.
So we were really like struggling. I think V-Ray wasn't even the version 1. I think it was like 09 or something.
Right.
And I clearly remember that day where you came in and you made them implement the V-Ray buffer outputs.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I think I remember reading an article or something like that. And I was like, yeah, finally somebody convinced them to do it.
Yeah. Well, we should, it was funny because you and I definitely had some influences on the company throughout, its history as we were working on it. But I do remember very specifically because, the V-Ray forum has been and still is, very active in terms of people supporting each other, et cetera, et cetera. But you and I think were the only people at that time that were talking about Maya because everyone else was like, why wouldn't Maya's not what you don't need Maya? I was like, yeah, sometimes you do. And so it was a thing that like, I'm not saying Max is bad. I mean, like you're like me, like Max and Maya are two different packages. They all have their advantages, but we needed it. And I remember we were like the first ones to sort of like say, okay, let's start figuring out how we're going to get V-Ray and Maya going as well. But I remember that frame buffer thing. It was specifically because of what I had been doing in RenderMan at the time as like V-Ray needs to be able to do these outputs because I didn't really see the, in the early days of visual effects, I didn't really see the need for AOVs, right? And then when I saw it in RenderMan, I was like, oh, yeah, this is cool. This is really helpful, And so, I think, I convinced Vlado and to start implementing. And this is back when it was still just, I think it was just Peter and Vlado. It was two people for the whole company.
Yeah. So it's a pretty big step, to be honest.
Oh, yeah. Huge step.
Yeah.
Huge step. Yeah.
And I think in the future, it actually paid dividends big time.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing is that's cool about it, and it's still to this day, Vlado listens to people, listens to what people has to say and is interested in their ideas. So, which is a very, very cool thing because it's very useful to have that information. So, well, cool. Okay. So Battlestar Galactica, how long were you working on that for?
For about a year.
Okay.
So we worked on the first season and then that show was over, and that company that I worked for, they worked on a couple of smaller like B-rated features. And I think this was like 2004, 2005 that I decided that I'm going to go and look for work at like a bigger studio because I was always working at like a smaller studios. Just a couple of people, which was really a lot of fun. You get to know people very closely and you spend long hours with them. So like you get to trust them and you learn from each other. But I also felt that like I wanted to go to a bigger facility like Image Engine, which was, I think around 25 people at the time. And I had a lot of my colleagues from Vancouver Film School, they ended up going there.
Right.
So I reached out and they were like, yeah, come on over. So I came over and I ran into a bit of a problem right away because I was used to working in a small studio. And so like, you get like 5 people working on the show, everybody's doing their thing and everybody trusts each other. So, if one guy is doing animation, he's going to do a good job. And you don't kind of like tell him like, oh, this isn't working or whatever. But when I came to a bigger studio, there were like a lot of segregation, and I ran into a problem where I had some opinions about how things should be done, and like people were like, "Meh, we're not gonna listen to you," And so right away, like I felt like the scale of the company didn't care about the personal opinions of artists, even if they were good, you know. And at the time, Image Engine was using Maya and Mentor, and they were struggling with the memory and all that stuff. And I tried to suggest V-Ray to them, but they brushed me off like right away, just like forget about it. It's not a production tool. And so I had a bit of arguments with them about that.
Right.
And I don't think they've ever actually implemented V-Ray into their pipeline, even today.
I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah, I think they went with 3D Light, and after that, probably Arnold, and that was that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Image Engine's still around. It's still a pretty well, respected company in inside Vancouver for sure.
Yeah, they are, and they do great work. And when like can't really speak for 3D Light. It's a variant of RenderMan, and
it's a RenderMan clone.
Yeah. I think they ran into some problems there, actually.
Yeah, they even just read rib files, so it's pretty much RenderMan clone, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you probably won't be able to get away with that today.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how but maybe they had a deal. Maybe they licensed stuff. I don't know.
But I'm pretty sure they were using Arnold like after a point. So
sure.
It just kind of made sense. If they don't go V-Ray, they're probably going to go Arnold.
Right.
Yeah, and right now, like they're really big. I don't know about right now, but like before the crisis and all that stuff, like there were hundreds of people. I think a couple of hundred for sure. So
right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you didn't stay at Image Engine too long. It sounds like.
No, and I mean, like we worked on Stargate and a couple of feature films,
right.
And like my experience was going up. So I think they were also looking for work. And they kind of said like, hey, we don't know if we have enough work coming up. So I went and I started looking, and I got a job at Zoic.
Zoic in Vancouver.
Zoic was, and Zoic was also using Maya and Manta Ray, and I was trying to push V-Ray there, and they actually went for it. And in the beginning, like it wasn't like all working correctly, but I think like after a while, Zoic was all with V-Ray. Like even after I left, they began to like fully utilizing it. I think it was also the time when Manta Ray was dying off, and the development was kind of just stopping on Manta Ray. Like a lot of plugins in Manta Ray were just like abandoned, and it was like complete disarray. Like nobody knew what was going on. But there was also a period at Image Engine where I learned a lot of Manta Ray, and there was a lot of good features in it. Like that Manta Ray render engine was pretty good engine. It was very flexible, even though you could push it into like non-photorealistic, non-physical dimension. I remember creating a custom shader where it would allow me to color correct the shadows of each light separately in the shader. And that was pretty powerful, like the setups that we could do with that, And I was like always asking Vlad or whatever, like, hey, Manta Ray has these things. And I don't think he really liked that I was always comparing it to Manta Ray.
I don't think he cares, honestly. I think he's like, well, what is a feature that you enjoy? I mean, it's the same thing with me. Like I was like, hey, you know what? RenderMan's got this really cool frame buffer history thing where you can record your previous renders and you can flip between them. And he's like, okay, we'll put that in there.
Yeah. I mean, there are like, for me, because I became like pretty much like a technical director on the shading level where I could like really dive in and dissect the nodes and make stuff out of them. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about like less than 1% of all artists who will ever do that. Like majority of people, they just want like finished stuff, like bring in the material, plug in a texture, it looks great right away, I don't have to care, and just render it. Right?
Well, I find it ironic, and I'm sure you do too. I mean, I remember when V-Ray came about and when people were using it, people would say, V-Ray is too simple. Like it needs to be more complicated. You need to have control over every aspect of the shader. And I was like, yes, no. I mean, you can get away with it without doing that. And what's funny now is that all the renderers are super simple, and V-Ray is suddenly like, they're saying, well, V-Ray is now got too many options, right? And I think it's funny. He was like, yeah, well, it's not that it has too many options. It's always been flexible in that way, but it's interesting.
I really like that though. Like I have like one of the reasons I stick with V-Ray today even is because of the versatility that now it has. And I've worked with other renderers, and I do feel like they're borrowing a lot from V-Ray. like the user scaler, for example. Not many people know what it is. It's such a powerful feature.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing that in V-Ray for the first time. I actually didn't know what it did. Somebody had to explain it to me. And then later, I go to Redshift and bang, same feature. It is so similar that you don't even need to redo anything if you want to change the shader. It reads the exact same attribute and everything. So
go ahead and explain to people what that is.
Well, it's basically allows you to mark an object with an ID, like a number.
Yep.
And then you can use that number to mask certain parts of it. So you can assign different colors, or you can switch objects based on the object number. And that's like right now with the multi-subtexture, for example, it has a option for texture switch. That you plug in the user scaler directly into it. And then let's say you have 5 objects, number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in multi-subtexture, you have 5 different inputs.
Yep.
And so it'll assign those different inputs to the different objects by their number. And, when you're texturing and shading stuff procedurally, or just handling objects procedurally, this is the absolute best way. I mean, I've integrated this into our pipeline where you have an alembic, like a complex alembic with hundreds of shader IDs, which is what we call them here. It's shader ID is basically a number that certain objects have. And then in the end, you cache that out and you bring that in and assign a single material. So you assign a switch material.
Yep.
And then the switch material has different shaders plugging into it.
Yeah.
And we have nested switch materials. So we could have 5, 6 different switch materials.
Yep.
Each has 9 shaders.
Yep.
And then the user scaler will basically say, okay,
determine
object
which
so-and-so
one
will
get this one and this one. Yeah.
Yeah. And it creates a lot of control and a lot of flexibility.
And that's just something to say is, but with robust pipelines like that, I mean, it's really kind of cool. When I was, working in big productions and stuff, like a Digital Domain, for example, we had a system where, when you put the file input, you just put in the word diffuse and it would go to the database and find the published diffused texture for that object. And so if you change it to a different object, it will find a different texture for that other object because everything's published in a database. So you never really had to go and find a path and do this and do that. So it's the same shader would work on both and it would just automatically find the textures that it needed to do.
That's very similar to what we have here.
Yeah.
It's almost the same. I mean, it's probably not at that level because we don't have a database like this.
Right.
But on the simpler assets, I pretty much never really do that.
Right.
Right now, we've sort of been utilizing PBR shading a lot.
Yep.
So Substance will just export a bunch of textures. You plug them in.
Done.
It kind of looks great right away, you know. And then you do a bit of shading on top of that with a bit of customization and it's done. But on the more complex assets, definitely I would tag all the pieces. So we were doing this show called Astronauts. And it was this massive spaceship, which was made out of dozens of objects, and each object had hundreds, if not thousands of pieces. Right. And I decided that, you're not going to assign a shader to every single object. That's just going to be crazy. Right. So the spaceship basically comes with these temporary shaders that are basically like Maya viewport blinds.
Right.
And then on the back side of it, the V-Ray switch material is connected to all the override shaders.
Got it.
Because the thing is with V-Ray switch material, when you display it in viewport, it's kind of black.
Yes.
Because Maya doesn't actually know, or V-Ray doesn't know what material it's going to display, right? It all happens at render time.
Yes.
So we kind of use Maya viewport materials for previous purposes.
Right. Got it.
And then that rendering, it switches. So then we labeled every object, it was like rocket A, B, C, thruster 1, 2, 3, whatever. and then we just had one material for the entire spaceship.
Right.
Based on those tags and so on, it found texture sets and it found versions and all that stuff. And that's a really big power from V-Ray that I really enjoy working with on a daily basis, is that kind of flexibility. And I know now other renderers also do that. Like I know Redshift does it, Arnold does it. So.
Well, yes. I mean, the fact is, right, all these renderers, if a studio is going to go from one renderer to another one, they have to maintain feature sets. So all the renderers have to maintain the same feature set, right? It's kind of like one car puts, cruise control into their car, and then all the other cars have to put cruise control into their cars too.
Yeah, for sure.
Slightly different variations, the switch is in a different place, but they all basically do the same thing. So
yeah. And you know what? Like over the years, because of being like V-Ray loyalist, I gotten so many arguments with people about, somebody was like, oh, Arnold is better, or that just looks like V-Ray. And I actually took people on challenge and be like, hey, make me a render and I'll match that render in V-Ray 1-to-1. You will not be able to tell a difference.
Well, that's actually a big point, because technically speaking, especially when we're talking about full ray tracing, right? Full ray tracing is a mathematical, physically trying to recreate exact things, right? When you're going on a render and you're trying to make them, compare one to the other, if you do your job correctly, they should match 100% to each other. Yeah, exactly. 1 + 1 = 2, no matter what calculator you use. It's always going to be 2, unless you have a really bad calculator, then don't trust that calculator, but it's going to be 2. And then you should match. And then the only thing that matters is how long did it take you to get it to look that way, and how long does it take to render? And that's all that matters, really. So
and actually on the render time aspect, just very recently, somebody said, we're working on this 4K show, and they were like, oh, is it okay that you render it because, the render time will be crazy? And I said, we no longer care about render time. And he was like, what?
Yeah.
I never heard that before. It's like, because if you're smart and you understand how things work, you don't need a render that renders for 10 hours.
Right.
But actually on Tron, we did have renders that ran for like 20 hours per frame.
We got to talk about Tron, because I was on Tron too. So
it's an interesting thing, because I think we were sharing assets with DD.
Yeah. Where were you working at? Which company were you working at the time?
I was Prime Focus.
Oh, Prime Focus. So, got it. Yeah.
Prime Focus acquired Frantic Films.
Yep.
And I was just there during that sort of phase. And then later they got to work on Tron. And so I came on to help. And
what sequence were you doing?
So the one with the solar sailor, they call it like this transport ship. Where they're like running away from the bad guys, and
they're going to the big recognizer.
Yeah. And so we got all the assets from Digital Domain, and they were insane, like just crazy detailed and all that stuff. But we had to shade them and texture them and like eventually render them. And there was a stereo show as well.
Yep.
So we were rendering just 2K. It wasn't even 4K. But just the CPU power just wasn't, what it is today. And like I think my workstation had like 16 gigs of RAM.
Right. And this is the earlier days of V-Ray for Maya was only maybe 2 years old at that time.
It was pretty fresh, but quite capable. Pretty fresh, but quite
to do
capable.
Tron.
And I actually remember reading your articles about the shading, what you called universal sampling. And like how it was working, and I was like trying to like match that and stuff. And and we just had the hardest time rendering that show, because it was the renderer's worst nightmare. It was dark, it was glossy, it was reflective like crazy, like all the surfaces were different kinds of glossiness and reflectivity and all that stuff. And we didn't have a huge farm. So, like 10 lighters went to submit however many shots, and the farm would be busy for weeks. Yeah. And I was guilty of that too. Like I was like, This was also in the day when there was still adaptive subdivision. People were using that for sampling.
Yeah, oof, don't do that.
And so we had like all these arguments with like one another of what was better, because it was flickering a lot, right? And I just remember like we were finally on the left eye, right, and then submitting the right eye as the secondary render, and we were like, okay, we got all these shots finalized. Let's submit the right eye. We have 3 weeks to deadline, and we have like 2.5 weeks of render time.
Yep.
And I don't know if you know Laszlo, but Laszlo, he was like a very talented technical director back at Frantic and Prime Focus. He actually wrote like a tool that looked inside Nuke files, and it like discovered which had the latest left eye and compared them with the right eye, and triggered to submit the deadline the right eye for missing shots. It was pretty impressive.
Wow.
So
nice.
And so there were frames that were like basically running for like 24 hours, and some of them would fail.
Yeah.
And so what would happen is
I had a shot when we were on Oblivion. And if you in Oblivion, I don't know if you guys remember that, but there was the drones that would come by, and they had the big red eye, right?
Yeah.
And this was with same thing with Joe Kaczynski, and Joe Kaczynski knows V-Ray, which is kind of funny. So
he's
Joe,
an old Max guy, right?
Yeah. Well, he used mental ray and some stuff, and he used some V-Ray and stuff, but he knows his 3D for sure. But he. They wanted the drone eye to be completely physically accurate so we got the actual mechanical one that the prop guys or the effects guys constructed, and we like tried to like took wires to get the curvature of each part of the lenses so that when they move in and out they would do the stuff. And so we had that, and so it was like a big refraction nightmare thing, to get all, it's like a headlight shot in the thing. It was so complicated, but Eric Barba did not want it to be like to us to cheat in any way. So it's like, just get it till its final quality. And it was like the fireflies were everywhere. Right? So the only way we were going to do that was to actually just let it go for 25 hours a frame or something crazy like that. And then after that, the next versions of V-Ray, I think they started introducing the ability to do this clamping on certain things, and it would have taken that render time down to 5 minutes if we had. It's crazy. Yeah. I mean, like I was experimenting with Maxwell at the time when it just came out, and was like, everybody was like, "Oh my god, this new physical render," and I couldn't make it work. Like you had to set a render and come back the next day to see it. Right. It was like still really noisy, kind of cool looking, but still really, really super noisy. So in the end, like it was just not usable. Yeah. Unbiased rendering is not always a good way to go. No, it's not. No. And I know V-Ray has like a BPT tracer or whatever it's called. Yeah. I just don't even bother going in there. Like, why? Okay. That's fine. Okay, cool. So you're at Prime Focus. You're working on Tron, Solar Slayer. I love that sequence. I love Tron. It was a great show. It was very tough, and there was a lot of complicated stuff going on, but it was really fun doing that for sure. Yeah. And was that one of your favorite shows to work on? Yeah, definitely, for the same reasons. I mean, it was innovative. It was challenging. I used to approach things in a certain way where I always wanted to do the best possible job. So, if you ask me to shade something and texture it, I'll try to make it as best as possible. But it actually is detrimental to the process of production. I've spent a lot of time trying to make these assets look really, really good. And then the supervisor would see them and was like, nah, it looks wrong. The textures are not like what I want them. Change them, go back, and just burned a lot of time on that. And I wish back then I already was more experienced to understand that, hey, work loose, work rough,
get stuff blocked in fast, get them to see it and iterate on it, and let them arrive to the look that they want. It's not the look that what you want.
Sure.
And eventually we got there, but it would have been much, much easier. So big experience for sure.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Okay. And so where did you go from there?
I think I came back to Prime Focus for Final Destination 5.
Okay.
Which was like another big of the project for them. And they did that bridge sequence where the Lionsgate Bridge was collapsing. It was like in the beginning of the movie, it was like swaying and cars are falling into the water and people and so on. It was very ambitious, like very crazy project for the technology, it just pushed the limits like crazy. And when we did Tron in Maya, Final Destination, they did it in Max. And Max does not have referencing.
Right.
XRF is not referencing.
Right. Yeah.
And so they had those very talented guys like Laszlo and Eric. They wrote like a full-blown reference system for Max.
Okay.
It was just unbelievable. Like it had a database and it had the latest assets and it would cache them and bring them in. It was just insane, right? And we had Bobo there, and Bobo was handling like a lot of pipeline and deadline and I haven't worked in a facility since then that had that kind of level of technical directors who were like just amazing.
Right.
They had like 7 or 8 technical directors just locked in one room, and they were just writing like all this crazy stuff. And I think they used Naiad for water sims. And with Naiad, it was like Maxwell. You set it to run a sim and come back a week later.
Yeah.
And there was a shot of like the whole bridge falling into the water with like this massive splash. And there was a lot of problems, a lot of issues rendering it and simming it and all that stuff. So, but it was also a stereo show, so all the rendering had to be done on 2 eyes. And after that, I was so burned out. We were working just insane overtime. And I think a lot of that overtime is related to the limitations of the technology, both on the software and hardware levels.
Sure.
I don't work nearly as much overtime now, even though we do a lot of work and a big variety of work, but it's always like, Houdini can just do pretty much anything you throw at it.
Right.
Sure, it takes a bit of time, but it's not comparable to what it used to take,
Yeah, I mean, you don't sit and wait for things as much as you used to.
Not
right?
anymore, no.
Yeah.
And with modern technology, like the CPU speed and the render speed and even the simming, like a lot of simming can be done on the farm, or at least a part of it, So like, whereas before with Naiad, it was literally one guy with a box and he was just simming on his box.
Right.
And so after that, I took a break and I went to Technicolor.
Oh, okay.
So Technicolor had a small VFX department that then got absorbed by MPC. And I think it was called Black Box or Toy Box before that.
Okay.
And it was a really solid team, small team, like about 15 people. And they were really good guys, really did like really great work. And I was lucky to work with them for a bit. And after that, I think I was taking a lot more time off because I had kids. So I didn't have kids before. I could work like whatever. But then I got my son born, and suddenly I had other priorities. So I had to leave,
Right.
And I kind of started shifting focus away from just dedicating everything to work, So that was when I kind of like almost detached from like, I used to be like crazy about learning and like exploring new things. And couldn't wait to come back the next day to check the renders and stuff. And when I started, like, when my family grew and I started, like, my son was growing, and I was like, that stuff no longer is important to me, it's like other things.
Right.
So, and not until like a while after that, when he was older, that I kind of like started getting back into it. And by that time, I went to this company called LookFX.
Oh, yeah.
And they've opened up an office in Vancouver, and I worked with them for about a year. And we were lucky to work on shows like Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah.
And that was like probably one of the best experiences of my life, working with Matt Krantz and Wendy Lanning. We had some really like talented guys there as well.
What were you working on Game of Thrones?
We worked on season 3 and 4, I believe.
Oh, okay. Good seasons.
And maybe 5. I think it was 3 seasons. I think what happened was they had like this 911 thing in season 3.
Okay.
And we helped them out, and they were like, okay. So then they just gave us like some work on season 4 and 5.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like big work like Dragons or anything like that, like Pixamonda did. But it was decent enough that, we enjoyed working on it. And, it was also a good experience and a good show to work on. So everyone was happy,
Sure.
But then LookFX kind of ran into a bit of problem, and they had like financial issues. And I think they expanded way too fast. Like they had so many offices so soon. Like they opened like a couple offices at the same time. And then something happened with like a couple of projects, and they just couldn't survive. And we were like one of the last offices to kind of operate before completely shutting down. And after that, I went to ILM.
Oh, okay.
So
ILM,
I worked
Vancouver?
at ILM. Yeah, but not for very long. I think it was like a 6-month contract on Warcraft.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And, when I came to ILM, they were using Max and V-Ray for their environments and gen department, which was kind of like felt at home,
Yeah.
And I really liked working there and everything, except that I wasn't really interested in working in the big studio anymore.
Right.
I think if ILM came to Vancouver like 10 years before, I'd be all over that.
Right.
But at the time, like I already had my daughter and my son, and I couldn't spend 10, 12-hour days in the office like everyone else. And I was like, I'm probably going to go to a smaller studio or start something of my own. And that idea came where I was like, hey, maybe I can do like some small visual effects for, small shows that are happening in town, shows that can't really afford ILM or whatever. And that are looking for like creative ways on making the VFX. And not necessarily need like a full big studio or like a mid-sized studio or something. So I started exploring that idea, and there was some interest with that. But I was kind of like working a little bit on my own, and then a little bit at the studios, and then again a little bit of my own. So like during breaks on projects in studios, because you know how it is, like sometimes they have 2-3 projects, and then they might not have something for like a couple of months. So normally you just take the time off. But during that time off, I was working on my own. And as I was doing that, I was like acquiring more and more interest about doing that. So then I think like 2015, I was like, I'm just going to try do this full time. And it was kind of just like your garage setup where I had a couple of render nodes in my garage, and then a couple of workstations in my office, and my kids were running around, and I was rendering and doing stuff, and it was a bit crazy, but also kind of cool.
Yeah.
And I realized something. I realized that family is very important to me, and I could also work and spend time with my family during the day, which I couldn't do that before.
Yeah.
So if I was in the office for 12 hours for like 7 to 8 weeks for, I don't know, a couple of months, I would just never see them.
Yeah.
But here I could work from home and take like an hour lunch or whatever during the day, and spend time with my family, and then go back and work in the evening or something like that, some more, you know?
Right.
So I'm not saying like it was like completely easy, and there was definitely a challenge, you know, with the kids not running into your office and just creating this crazy moment. But
right.
I figured like I'd try and work like that for a while, and it just started going more and more and more. And then when the pandemic happened, everyone started working from home, at least for a certain time. And I was already set up to do that. And right now, I think we have like this sort of influx of work, and those who were like set up and prepared for it ahead of time kind of got the benefit a little bit.
Yep.
Because a lot of my friends started working from home, and they were like, "This is insane! Like I can't deal with it. This is crazy. Right. I can't focus, you know, and all that stuff." And for me and for my artists, it was like pretty much like every other day. So
right. Yeah, I didn't know what was going to happen when the pandemic happened, you know, and how we were going to deal from home. And then I immediately, everyone's going to be different, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, but I felt like suddenly I didn't have to drive to work. That's 2 hours of my day, or 2.5 hours from my case, because I live in Los Angeles, that I didn't have, that I had back to myself. And then lunch with your kids is kind of fun, you know?
Yeah. It's exactly what I felt, the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And it's hard to explain it to people who don't have kids, you know, and who are like really hard working people, that they're so committed that they're like, no, I got to be at the office. This is where I get all my work done. And that's fine. But when you have kids and you shift the priorities there, and you also have less time, right? So like you said, you gain 2 hours, and those 2 hours are a lot of time. It's really valuable.
Yep.
And it's like, I've been asked to come back to various studios very often. And I just run the numbers, and where I live right now, it's like an hour or more from the offices as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to go there, have lunch, couple of meetings, couple of breaks, and then come back, that's like 4 hours to spend 8 hours in the office.
Right.
You know, and I have better things to do during the day.
Yep. Yeah, we're at that age, so it's different.
Exactly.
But yeah. And that's okay. I mean, things are eventually going to go back to, a more flexibility. But I think that one thing that the pandemic did prove is that this is possible, and so therefore we're going to be able to continue to take advantage of that. At least I hope, and not pretend like I should. Maybe I'll go to work once a week. Friday, something like that,
Yeah.
So that's the way I see it at this point. But yeah, it's great. It's great. And I really like how you've prioritized your life, but you're still enjoying everything. You're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting to enjoy what you do and also spend as much time with your family as possible. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah, I do feel luckier than some people, because, I kind of enjoy working and doing what I do for work. And that's something that, like, you ask an average person, like, do you enjoy crunching those numbers in your bank? And they're like,
right.
So yeah.
Sorry, my camera went out, but that's all right.
You
can manage without it. I forgot to plug it into the backup battery, but that's okay.
Oh, no worries.
Well, that's cool. That's cool, Dmitry. I mean, this is really, really interesting, and I really think it's fabulous that you're doing this, and you've done always great work, and I've always admired your enthusiasm, and you are definitely a very important part of the V-Ray and chaos history in terms of how we got to where we are today. So that's really awesome. But what are you thinking about the future? I mean, obviously, we know you found a good way to balance your work and your life at the same time. What's your thoughts on the future of where we want to go?
Well, I think a couple of things. Like, even since early 2000s, I was kind of hoping that the GPU rendering will be the thing, and that it'll allow us to work less, if you know what I mean. Like,
right.
Like, you wait for the render, and when you wait for the render, you kind of like, you can't do anything. You have to wait. And I was hoping that, the GPU will kind of render so fast, it'll basically be real-time rendering, and then it'll allow you to do way more stuff in a lot less time. But still, like, there is sort of like this curve that's happening, right? Like, the hardware is getting faster, but the demand is getting higher at the same time, like rendering 4K, rendering 60 FPS or whatever it is. And I've got like a pretty fast GPU, but still I can't render in real time. And that's something that I really wish, or that I'm still looking forward to, maybe one day we have either a GPU or a CPU that is so fast that, instead of like clicking and waiting for the geometry to compile and for the textures to get loaded, and for the displacement to get sampled or whatever it is, and then the buckets to show up and do their thing, you don't click anything. It's there, and you just switch cameras, like almost like Unreal. Unreal, you don't render, right? It's already there.
Right. But that's still a rasterized render.
Yeah, right. But that's sort of the idea, is that, and Unreal is kind of an interesting thing on its own, because like everybody is saying, oh, it's going to replace your conventional visual effects, but I don't think so at all. Because
I think it's going to have a huge impact. I think Unreal may have a huge impact, or not just Unreal, all real-time engines and game engines will have a huge impact on the visual effects world, but not necessarily for their rendering. They're really a great way of assembling things. There's a lot of power that they can do, because if it wasn't for some of the things that are going on in Unreal and Unity, virtual production is not going to be around. I mean, look how far they got with Motion Builder, and that was a program that did nothing for years, and now finally they have something capable going on. I think that there's a lot of interesting things, but not necessarily just for the rendering. I still feel, and I'm sure you would back me up, that full ray tracing is still ultimately the goal of a final image, right? Yeah, and it's still ways to go, but I'm certain that we will get there. Yeah, it's a lot harder than we would, we were thinking about, like when we were getting the GPUs and we were like, hey, it's got 3,000 cores, it's going to render so fast, but it just doesn't scale like that at all, and maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, who knows how long it will take, but ultimately, I think it might be even my kids, like my son, he's really interested in Unreal, and he's learned it and learning it every day. He's like just, setting up stuff in there, and maybe he will get to enjoy that kind of benefit where, 20 years from now, I'm already done with rendering and all that stuff, but he's completely into it. Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be much sooner than 20 years when things change. Yeah. I don't know. It's true though. It's great. I mean, it's really cool. And look at this. I mean, like you said, you're at home and you're teaching the next generation, and they're learning from a new place, right? I mean, think about when you were learning on that 286 and trying to say, how do I make this game look like it did? And now, your son is sitting there and playing in Unreal. That's kind of awesome if you really think about it, right? There's a lot of time between, right? Yeah. There's 20 years between those two times, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I mean, technology, you know how it is, like technology it skyrockets, right? Like it's exponential growth.
Right.
And the CPU that we have today is going to be like overpowered by a CPU like a couple of years from now that's going to have like 500 cores or something, you know?
Right.
And that's been the case so far with every previous generation of CPU and GPU for that matter as well, right?
Right.
So, you know, now we have GPUs with 24, 32 gigs of RAM, and in
48.
some years we'll have, yeah, right? So,
yeah.
Like when I build my workstations, I kind of like go full out because I know that the power is needed to do the work that we need is like very demanding, right? So
sure.
I build a workstation and I get like the best hardware that I can get, and then look at that workstation 5 years from now, and the hardware is just laughable.
Right.
You know, so hopefully next 5 years.
There could also be a big shift. I mean, there could also be a big shift. I've been seeing, you know, I try to follow as much as possible, and I do a lot of great testing. Obviously, I work very closely with NVIDIA, and I'm very fortunate they gave me all of their latest hardware to test. So I have some very, very powerful hardware that I get to play with, which is nice. But, you know, if you think about also what's going on, you know, with Apple, for example, and that, you know, and I'm not necessarily a big Apple fanboy at all, but that M1 chip is kind of interesting. And that if that idea of a new kind of way of thinking about a system on chip like that takes off, and everything sort of becomes a little bit more centered around that area, that could be interesting because it would completely change the way you think about hardware. You know what I mean?
I agree. And I think like sort of current hardware configurations are kind of like the old school cars.
Right.
You know, then Tesla comes along and it's like completely different and innovative and it's better. And I think like the electric technology, even though it's really like new, after some time, it's going to be the future. And, you know, we have the current sort of established expectation that you have a CPU, you have a motherboard, then you plug in the video card into it, and some RAM modules. It's kind of, it looks pretty primitive and obsolete to me, you know?
Yep.
So who's to say that like you just maybe have to think outside the box a little bit and come up with something that's like integrates everything together at a different level or something that is then so much faster, and then you don't need all these extra components.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the bottleneck of the GPU is the bus between the CPU and the GPU. But if you eliminate that and then it's all the same thing, then it doesn't matter anymore. You know?
Or you just, you know, the GPU, like the whole idea that it's just meant for graphics, kind of actually went against it a little bit, I think, because sure, NVIDIA makes them for games and those kind of things. And some of the other GPUs that they make are like the more of like a supercomputer type, right? But they're not really accessible to consumers. Like, you know, even myself, like I can't get those really expensive, like $10,000 cars or whatever.
Yeah.
But if they made them so that they're versatile, that they're not GPU basically, but almost like a CPU, that they can handle everything and it's easy to write stuff. Because like a lot of times when there is a problem with the GPU render, let's say, and you write it on the Chaos forum or and say like, hey, so feature doesn't work. And the reply is, oh, it's because it's hard to write stuff for the GPU.
Right.
Or it's hard to make it work with the GPU.
Right.
Never hear that about the CPU, right?
Right.
And I think like if NVIDIA kind of like opened up and just kind of modified how they make things and made it so that it's not a GPU that's just for the graphics, I think that would, you know, broaden that spectrum a lot.
Well, they are trying to, we work with them very closly. So we definitely have, you know, things that we've gotten in their features, and they're both in the hardware and their drivers and their settings that have benefited. So our relationship with NVIDIA has gone on for a very long time, and generally pretty good. But you're right. It is a challenge, and it is a different render, and it's a different way of thinking. And those challenges sometimes are not necessarily present when you're doing CPU rendering for sure.
No, and it's kind of like why I kept an eye on the GPU, but I've never like decided, okay, today I'm switching to GPU and never looking back.
Right.
I've gotten the fastest cards that I could get and did the test renders with them. And sure, some things they render really, really quickly, like substantially faster. But you probably know this very well. When you put something really insane on the GPU, like a complex scene with hundreds of subdivision objects and displacements and thousands of textures, that's it. And
there's a RAM problem. Yeah. Especially if 24 gigs of RAM, or 12 gigs of RAM, whatever you happen to have, is you can chew that up pretty quickly. Especially exactly, when CPU right? RAM is cheap, it's like.
Yeah. And I think I was talking to someone on the forum about that. And I said, I just upgraded my farm and I went from 64 gigs to 128 gigs. And it cost me like $3,000.
Right.
For
the whole farm.
10 machines.
Yeah. For 10 machines. Yeah.
Yeah. But can you do the same with the NVIDIA card? No. Right.
Well, no, you'd have to buy. The problem, I've heard this from other studios. The problem is that these cards, they keep getting better and better and better, which is great, and every year they're getting better. But that also means you've got to buy new cards every year, and that's expensive.
Right, yeah. It's expensive, and like I don't know, RTX 3090 or
impossible to find right now. Yeah.
It's impossible to find. It's a different problem. But let's say if it was, it's still like almost a $2,000 card.
Sure.
And you need like at least 10 of them to get something rendered, right? And so basically $20,000 just, and then 2 years from now, some new car comes out that's just
and you got to
3 times faster.
Yep. And that's exactly what happened with these cards. Like there's, cards that you had from 2 generations ago are the new cards now are so good that they're 5-6 times faster than the ones you bought 2 years ago. And so you definitely feel like, you're missing out. So yeah, for sure.
But I think it's a trap because, you commit, you buy them, and then later these new cards come out, then you buy those, and then later same thing happens. Whereas with the CPUs, like you can buy like powerful CPUs and they'll be good for the next 5 years.
Well, you can say that, or you can also say that CPUs don't progress anymore, right? And GPUs do. So
yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at it, but at the same time, there is some big innovations. The AMD CPUs out there are crazy good right now. I've got one with 128 threads on it. That's insane.
Yeah, the Threadripper 3, right? That's the same that I have. And it was the first AMD that I bought in like 20 years.
Yeah.
Because there's no comparable Intel at the same price point. Mm-mm. There's just none, right?
Yeah.
And I think AMD is not finished. Like they're building, I think, 256
maybe
thread now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a big CPU. Like when you look at it, it's pretty large.
Yeah, it's chunky.
But whatever, it works, right? It gets the job done. I mean, like all my other machines, all the farm machines that I have are all Intel. And they are E5s, like pretty fast. But the Threadripper is at least 2 times faster than any of them.
Right. Yep.
And the versatility, like that's the bottom line. I can render 100 gig of RAM scene on it, or I can render hair, or I can render particles. I can render Phoenix Sims.
Yeah, everything's going to work.
GPU, I don't know if some of it, like, you set up the pipeline, you get into the rendering, and then something doesn't work. It's just not supported, right?
Right.
And then you're like, oh crap, now I got to go back and roll back or redo it or something. And that's something you don't want to be doing, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
For sure, dude. Well, this is awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming down, for, talking to us. And it's been awesome to have you on the podcast. I'm really glad that, Anna was able to suggest this and make this happen. So I was like, oh, great idea. She goes, what do you think about doing a podcast with Dmitry? It's like, I don't know why I didn't think of this. So, so it's really, really great to have you on, and definitely let's try to get together at some SIGGRAPH, or at some point we will be able to reconnect at some point and share a beer. That'd be great.
When this whole thing passes, man, for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
sounds great.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks a lot for doing this.